Welcome back to take 4 of the weaving crafting video. If you see some string, you're going to have to forgive it. I've tried to mark out where my camera area is so that I'm not off camera this time. So, today we're going to be using a few simple supplies and a very easy technique to create a wide variety of projects. Just using cardboard and scissors and yarn, we can create coasters or mug rugs, depending on what you like to call them, placemats, hot pads, decorative boxes, and with the addition of tape we can even create a pouch. You can use any kind of yarn that you would like or any brand that you have on hand. If you're planning on creating a hot pad, I don't recommend you using acrylic yarn as it will melt with the extreme heat. But as you can see, I've got a worsted weight singles, I've got some fluffy bulky yarn, some extremely bulky yarn, some worsted weight yarn, and then I do have an acrylic, but I won't use that if I'm going to make a hot pad. So any kind of yarn that you have on hand would work well. If you have lace weight or DK double knit weight yarn, I would not recommend using that as it will take forever. If you're experienced and you want this to be a very long-term project, then you can use very fine yarn and get very detailed with it. Let's get started by creating our looms. No matter which kind of project you're going to be using, creating the loom is very simple, very easy, and starts with these first few steps. You're going to be using the cardboard and cutting notches in each end. In one end you're going to want an odd number of notches, in the other end you're going to want an even number of notches. Your odd number of notches needs to be one more than your even number. So this is a very small loom. I'm going to probably cut 4 on one side and 5 on the other. If you would like to be exact, you can measure about an inch in from either end and then cut your notches about half an inch to 3/4 of an inch apart. But I'm not going to be too exact, so like I said, I'll do 1, 2, 3, 4 cuts on this side, turn it around, and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cuts on this side. And now you've created your basic loom. The next step is going to be to warp them. If you have kids and you're hoping to do some science, technology, engineering, and mathematics or STEAM work with them, you can have them experiment with the number of notches. What happens if there's more notches than this? What happens if you're using less notches? How does it look? How well does the structure hold up? If you use an even number, what happens when you're weaving? Things like that. You can experiment with kids. So to start warping, you take the yarn and you grab a length, you pull a length off and you cut it off from the ball. Any lengths that you're using need to be cut off from the ball. You can't do anything straight from the ball. It just doesn't work too well. So you can tie a knot in this and then loop it over the edge, or you can just have it hanging over the back. This is the tail. We're going to use about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of tail and put it down in the first notch on the odd side of the loom, the one that has more cuts. Just snug it down in the notch, pull it across. Now this cardboard is curving already, but when you're warping your loom, you don't want to pull it so much that the cardboard curves. That's going to wind up messing around with your tension later. But you don't want it so loose that it's curled up. You just want it to be a nice, even, straight line from one end of the loom to the other. Then you snug it down in the notch opposite. And then what you do is you take your yarn and you put it around the back of the loom between the 2 notches. And you put it up into the notch next to it, which creates a small loop on the back of your loom. We'll take care of that later. Okay? And then you run it back up to the next notch opposite. And you keep doing that, running it around the back, up the notch, down the loom, up that notch, around the back, and up that notch, and then back up to the front and around this notch. Now, this is your extra warp space for a warp thread, but so you are going to put your yarn around the back and up that last warp notch, and then when you run it down, you're going to put it into the same notch as your last previous warp thread, which creates that V. But when you're starting to, this is for a mug rug, so when you're starting to weave, you would start on that end, and as you're weaving across, you would separate that out. Now, this is the very basic loom. You can do it on a larger scale. If you want to make something like a placemat, you can see the notches are already cut, and you can warp that up and start weaving for a placemat. I'll show you one of the pitfalls of that in a second. However, you do have another option with this kind of loom. Now that you have it warped up, what you can do is you can take your loom and fold the wrong sides together. I'm sorry, there's one more step first. You're going to want to take some tape and tack down your first warp end to the back of the loom so that it's not going to go slipping around. Okay, so if you want to make a pouch, you can fold your loom together. Now, you can probably see the problem. Where there's 5 on one side and 5 on the other, that's 10 warp ends, which means that it's an even number of warp ends. You always want to have an odd number of warp ends, but we can take care of that. Now that we know approximately where the middle of the loom is, we can cut a notch in the middle of the loom, and taking this last warp end out of the notch where it was doubled up, we take this warp end and we put it through the notch at the center of the loom. Cut off the extra tail. Try that again. Cut off the extra tail. We'll use that to start weaving later. And then tape this tail down so that it's not going to go slipping everywhere. Take the 2 ends of the loom, put them together, approximately equal as best you can. Flatten down the bottom, and then I take a piece of tape because you can see it likes to bounce apart again. So I just take a piece of tape and covering just the very ends of the loom, you then fold it over, and that seals the loom. So now you can start weaving. Weaving horizontally on this loom is very easy. All forms of weaving are the same thing. It's always over 1, under 1. So we're going to start by going under this first warp thread, over the next one, under the next one, over the next one, under the next one. Okay, so this is your tail, and this is your main portion because it's longer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by tucking the tail under. So I've got almost 1 row on this side. Well, I've got 1 entire row on this side, and then turning it over. Since I went under this warp thread, the next one needs to be over. So I will tuck it under this warp thread. There we go. Just a little tuck. Okay. And then we're going to ignore that and get started with the rest of the warps. Again, I was under this warp thread, so when I turn the loom around, I will be going over this warp thread. So over the first one, under the second one, Okay. The only thing that's tricky is you want to make sure that this is snugged up to the side of the loom, and that's going to keep your tension even. The cardboard will hold your weft thread steady. The horizontal is always called the weft thread. So under that one, over this one, and then under this one here, the last one on this side. And then when you turn your weaving over, you can see you're going to be doing the opposite of what you did on this first weaving. So the first time, you can see you went under this warp thread. So you're going to be going over this warp thread. And you know that you're doing it right and that you have the right number of warps because you are going over this one where you went under the last time. So you'll be going over this one, under this one, over this one, under this one. If you have a tapestry needle, you can use that. It's not necessary because your fingers can do everything that you need them to do. Well, when you've got more dexterity than I do. If you don't have the dexterity, again, you can actually just make your loom bigger, use bigger yarn, and it will make things easier. Or if you have a tapestry needle, you can use that. There we go. So we'll just finish this half row. Okay, so you can see that this is done properly because it was under this one and it's over this time. It was over that time, under that time. And so that's a good way to double check that you've done it right. So when you're doing the pouch loom, you need to make sure that after you've gotten a few rows woven, you need to push them all to the bottom. If you don't have everything pushed to the bottom, then it's not going to create a bottom to your pouch. So it takes quite a few picks. It takes a little while, but after a little while, you have a nice bottom to your pouch and you can start moving up the sides. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to add on a new yarn to your weaving.